what if the chaos we're seeing right now, the bitter political division, the punishing inflation, the whole sudden shifting of global power, what if it isn't actually a unique, unprecedented crisis?
Right.
What if it's just, the completely predictable end of a 250-year timer going off?
It is a really jarring perspective shift
Hmm.
because when you're standing in the middle of a major historical transition, it feels entirely random.
Yeah, totally.
It feels like the ground is just breaking apart underneath you for literally no reason.
But to a seismologist, right, who studies those deep fault lines, that earthquake isn't random at all.
Yeah.
It's the inevitable mathematical release of tectonic pressure
Hmm.
that's been building up for decades.
Exactly.
And right now, looking at the global economy, it really feels like we're standing on some deeply shaky ground. We're experiencing things that haven't happened in our lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
0% interest rates, massive debt monetization, extreme wealth gaps, and a rising global rival challenging the current world order.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission for you is to decode the hidden 500-year-old patterns of history. We want to give you a mental model to understand exactly why the world is changing so dramatically right now.
And our source material for this is Ray Dalio's exhaustive macroeconomic study, The Changing World Order. He analyzed the rises and falls of the world's most dominant empires over the last half millennium.
Right.
Specifically, he's looking at the Dutch, the British, and the American empires, alongside their reserve currencies.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core premise here is that while humanity's overall productivity and living standards, they always trend upwards over time, right? Because humans constantly learn and invent things.
Yeah, the baseline always improves.
Right. But the turbulent swings around that upward trend, those are driven by what we can call the big cycle, the cycle of wealth, power, and debt.
And to see that cycle clearly, we first really need to understand the archetypical lifespan of an empire. Because on a macroeconomic scale, empires operate remarkably like living organisms. They have a life cycle of roughly 250 years.
Oh, that's specific.
Yeah, basically. They ascend, they reach this sprawling peak, and then they structurally decline. This cycle is driven by 17 historical forces, but there are 8 key metrics that truly define the strength of an empire.
And those are?
Education, innovation and technology, competitiveness, military power, trade, economic output, financial center strength, and finally, reserve currency status.
Reading through the sources, I kept thinking about this progression like playing a really long, high-stakes game of Monopoly.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right, because the rules dictate that early advantages just mathematically snowball. You buy up the cheap properties early that lets you build the greenhouses, which generates the rent required to buy a red hotel.
And then that eventually bankrupts anyone who lands on your space.
Exactly. And looking at these 8 metrics, there's a distinct sequence to how an empire builds its monopoly board. Education is always the long leading indicator. But reserve currencies, that's having the money that the rest of the world uses, that is the long-lagging indicator.
What's fascinating here is the mechanism behind that lag. It is incredibly important. A reserve currency survives long after the empire itself has started to rot, basically because of the network effect.
Like inertia, almost.
Pure inertia. Imagine trying to convince the entire planet to switch from speaking English to speaking Esperanto overnight.
Yeah, never going to happen.
Right, it's nearly impossible. Global trade contracts are already priced in that dominant currency. The international clearinghouses run on its plumbing. The commodities are bought and sold in it.
So the sheer friction and the cost of rewiring the entire global financial system just means nations will keep using a declining empire's currency until the system fundamentally breaks.
Exactly. Which means you can't just look at the currency to tell if an empire is healthy. We have to look at the whole chain reaction.
Yeah. Okay, walk me through that.
Well, a society invests heavily in strong education. And that means teaching both hard sciences and strong character. That educated population then invents new technologies.
Right.
Those technologies make the country highly competitive globally, which boosts trade.
And once you have fleets of super valuable trade goods sailing all over the world, a powerful military just becomes a strict economic necessity, right, to protect those supply lines.
Spot on. That global economic preeminence inevitably leads to the creation of the world's dominant financial center. Capital from all over the world just flows in.
And finally, because everyone inherently trusts that financial center, its currency becomes the global medium of exchange. Let's ground this theory in a real-world example for a second. Imagine you're a citizen living in Holland in the early 1600s.
Okay.
It's this tiny piece of marshy land in Europe, yet it is about to essentially rule the globe. The Dutch didn't just build great ships, they literally invented capitalism as we know it today.
Yeah, the Dutch Golden Age is like the absolute perfect archetype of the ascent phase. In the year 1602, the Dutch created the very first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company.
VOC, right?
Right. And to fund it, they created the first stock exchange. Because before this moment, funding a massive, really risky endeavor like sending a fleet of ships across the ocean that was restricted to royalty or the ultra-wealthy.
Yeah, if one ship sank, you were completely ruined. But by creating public debt and equity markets, a regular Dutch citizen could just buy a tiny fractional share of that voyage.
Exactly.
If the ship sank, they only lost a little bit. But if it came back full of spices, they shared in the massive profit. They effectively crowd-funded global dominance.
It was an unprecedented breakthrough in resource allocation. Amsterdam became the world's financial center. The Dutch guilder became the first true global reserve currency.
Wow.
And their education and innovation were so unparalleled that at their peak, the Dutch were responsible for 25% of all major global inventions.
That's insane. But here is where the model kind of challenges our assumptions. If the Dutch had the absolute best technology, the most advanced ships, the smartest financial system, and literally all the world's money flowing through Amsterdam, how do they lose that position?
Well, the structural tragedy of the peak phase is that the very mechanics of reaching the top plant the seeds for the downfall.
Success breeds complacency.
Always. As the Dutch, and we see the exact same pattern later with the British and the Americans as they became incredibly wealthy, their standard of living naturally rose.
Which means their labor force became really expensive.
Highly expensive, and therefore way less competitive on the global market. Furthermore, as generations change, the younger people inheriting this immense wealth just become accustomed to luxury.
Right. They don't have the same grit.
Yeah, they work less hard than the battle-hardened generations that built the empire in the first place. Meanwhile, rising rivals, they simply study the blueprints.
Oh, that's right. The sources note that British shipbuilders literally hired Dutch shipbuilding architects to design vessels.
Exactly. And then the British could just build them much more cheaply using their less expensive labor. Copying is always cheaper and faster than inventing.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The real trap is the currency itself. The sources call having the reserve currency an exorbitant privilege.
Yes.
Because you're the world's bank, everyone wants to hold your paper, which means everyone is willing to lend you money.
And it creates this incredibly dangerous illusion of endless strength. The empire appears to have, like, infinite spending power.
Right.
They can finance sprawling global military operations and fund massive domestic consumption at the exact same time. But secretly, all this overborrowing is hollowing out the empire's financial core.
They just go deeper and deeper into debt.
To sustain an empire that has mathematically become uneconomical to defend.
Wait, if the government is borrowing massive amounts of money to fund this sprawling military and huge domestic consumption, that money is primarily flowing through the financial sector, right? So the people who own the assets, the stocks, the shipping companies, they get vastly richer. But the people working the increasingly uncompetitive manufacturing jobs just get squeezed. Doesn't this structurally guarantee massive internal friction?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The economic success and the booming financial markets disproportionately benefit those at the top who own the financial assets.
So you get this rapidly widening wealth gap.
Exactly. The society polarizes into the haves and the have-nots, and that internal division is a fatal vulnerability when an economic downturn finally hits.
Which brings us perfectly to the mechanism driving that downturn, money and debt, because the decline is fundamentally tied to overborrowing. Looking at the sources actually completely changed how I look at the paper money sitting in my wallet right now.
Oh, yeah.
History shows that money always evolves through three distinct types. We start with type 1, hard money. Think gold or silver coins.
Right, and hard money has maximum credibility because it has intrinsic value. But it allows for minimum credit creation. You can't simply speak more gold into existence.
So to grow the economy faster, societies inevitably move to type 2 claims on hard money.
Yes. These are paper banknotes that promise you can exchange them for a specific amount of gold back in the vault.
And this allows for massive credit booms, right?
Yeah.
The banks can lend out way more paper claims than they have actual gold, assuming everyone won't ask for their gold at the exact same time.
Exactly. But The fatal flaw there is the bank run.
Right.
When people panic and want their hard money, the system collapses because the gold simply isn't there.
Which forces the final transition to Type 3 fiat money,
Yep.
unbacked paper money. The government just severs the tie to gold and declares, this is money because we say it is.
Yep. They gain the power to print as much currency as they want to bail out the debt system, but the risk shifts entirely to severe inflation and the eventual death of the currency's purchasing power.
This completely changes the metaphor for late-stage debt.
Yeah.
We often hear it described as a ticking time bomb, but that sort of implies a sudden, randomized explosion. Reading Dalio's analysis, it's much more like a massive Jenga tower. You're pulling foundational blocks of real economic productivity out of the bottom and stacking them on top as purely financial paper assets.
That is a perfect structural metaphor.
The tower gets taller, it looks incredibly impressive, but the base is being fundamentally hollowed out.
And this raises an important question. We can actually point to the exact historical moments when the tower swayed so dangerously that governments had to change the rules of the game.
Like when?
Well, on March 5th, 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt severed the U.S. dollar's domestic tie to gold. He did this so he could print money to fill the massive debt holes of the Great Depression. And then decades later, on August 15th, 1971, President Nixon severed the dollar's international tie to gold, ending the Bretton Woods system.
The Nixon shock. But wait, 1971 was over 50 years ago. The Jenga tower didn't fall immediately.
Because fiat systems can function for decades before the consequences fully manifest. The debt just compounds silently in the background. It's the classic boiling frog scenario.
People just keep pricing goods and services in the fiat currency out of habit.
Exactly. And the central banks manage the business cycle by gradually lowering interest rates. But eventually, interest rates hit zero. You can't lower them anymore.
So how does the tower finally tip? When the traditional tools stop working, what actually happens?
Well, when a central bank hits 0% interest rates and the economy is stalling, they turn to what Dalio calls Monetary Policy 3, or MP3.
Yeah.
This is when the central government borrows massive amounts of money, and the central bank simply prints new currency to buy that government debt.
Walk me through the actual invisible mechanics of MP3, because it doesn't just broadly make everyone richer, right? How does that newly printed money actually move through the system?
It moves through a mechanism known as the Cantillon effect.
Yeah.
The newly printed money doesn't go straight to the average worker. It enters through the financial system. Primary dealers, mega banks, and hedge funds get access to this liquidity first. And what do they do with it? They buy financial assets. Stocks, bonds, real estate.
So consequently, asset prices skyrocket.
Exactly. If you're wealthy and own a massive stock portfolio or multiple properties, your net worth doubles.
But if you rely on a fixed hourly wage, you don't see any of that printed money. Yet you still have to deal with the resulting inflation.
Yeah.
Your rent goes up, your grocery bill doubles, but your paycheck stays completely stagnant.
Precisely the dynamic. The newly printed money prevents a deflationary depression, but it supercharges the wealth gap to historic extremes. And this extreme inequality leads directly to intense political polarization.
And we must be incredibly clear about what the historical data shows regarding this polarization. Strict impartiality is required here when looking at the centuries of data Dalio provides.
Very true.
History shows that during these crisis periods, both left-wing socialists and right-wing capitalists become increasingly populist and increasingly autocratic. We are impartially reporting this historical pattern without taking any political sides whatsoever. It's just a statistical reality that extreme economic desperation drives populations to the absolute fringes.
Citizens basically begin demanding strongman leadership to bring order to the chaos and forcefully redistribute the wealth. And that bitter internal conflict makes the empire incredibly vulnerable on the global stage.
It basically creates the historical perfect storm for an empire's collapse.
Yeah.
You need 4 ingredients aligning at once, right?
Yeah.
Extremely high debt levels.
Yes.
A massive wealth and values gap causing internal fighting. An exogenous shock, like a severe drought. The Spanish flu in 1918, or, a modern pandemic.
Yes.
And finally, a rapidly rising, highly capable external rival power ready to challenge you.
And when those 4 elements align, the world order definitively changes. We saw it with the fall of the Dutch. In 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke out.
Right.
The rising British Empire systematically defeated the Dutch, who were overextended militarily, drowning in debt, and hopelessly divided internally.
It was over for them.
Yeah, the British victory bankrupted the Dutch, leading to the total evaporation of the guilder as a reserve currency.
And centuries later, the mighty British Empire suffered an eerily similar fate.
Right.
But what did that actually feel like on the ground for the average citizen? We talk about losing reserve currency status like it's just a minor accounting error.
It's not. On the ground, it meant a drastic, painful reduction in living standards. After the devastation and massive debts incurred during the two world wars, Britain lost its economic supremacy. They endured severe rationing long after the wars had ended.
Now,
And the Suez Crisis in 1956 brutally exposed that the United States now held the real financial and military power. The British pound lost its dominant status to the U.S. dollar.
so for the average Briton, it meant their money suddenly bought significantly less on the global market.
Exactly. The empire had to violently contract.
So what does this all mean for us today? If we look at our seismograph reading, what are our historical coordinates? Well, looking at the sources, the pattern is unmistakable. The U.S. is currently very late in the big cycle. We've seen zero-bound interest rates. We're seeing massive debt monetization through MP3. We're experiencing peak wealth and political gaps. And we have a rapidly rising, highly capable rival in China.
Which means we are in the middle of a transition phase. And for you, listening to this, it requires taking a hard, objective look at your own reality. You really need to evaluate your own financial safety margin.
What does that look like in practice for the listener? Like, what should they be asking themselves?
It means asking yourself the really difficult, uncomfortable questions. If your primary source of income completely disappeared tomorrow and your cash savings were suddenly cut in half by severe inflation or a massive currency devaluation,
Yeah.
how long would you actually survive? History shows us time and time again that during these major geopolitical and economic transitions, relying on the government to protect your purchasing power is a very dangerous bet.
That makes sense.
When push comes to shove, governments will always prioritize saving the structural system and inflating away the national debt over protecting the value of your personal cash savings.
That is a deeply sobering thought, but an absolutely necessary one to process. However, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Okay.
Throughout all of these incredibly brutal cycles, the rising and falling of the Dutch, the British, the Americans, the endless wars, the collapsing Jenga towers of debt, there is one constant. Human productivity, our incredible capacity to learn, adapt, and invent, has stubbornly continued to trend upward. We always figure out a way to improve the baseline of human existence.
That's very true. The upward trajectory of human innovation always survives the death of the specific empire that fostered it.
So if the historical pattern holds true, and the era of a single nation-state holding the entire world's reserve currency is inherently flawed, debt-ridden, and cyclical, could the next world order look entirely different? Could the future be one where economic power and the global reserve currency aren't tied to a single empire's geography or central bank at all? What if the next phase of human history is governed by decentralized, borderless productivity?
That's a huge question. The seismograph clearly shows the pressure building, but the landscape that emerges after the earthquake is entirely up to the innovators.
We were staring at the X-ray machine expecting a clean, simple break, but we were looking at the wrong scans entirely. The messy, cyclical truth of human history is right there if we're willing to look at the mechanisms driving it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll catch you next time.